Queensland state election is happening on the 31st of October. If you turn 18 before that date, you'll need to enrol to vote to have your say about Queensland's future. To enrol to vote, visit aec.gov.au.
A state election is happening soon.
Seats have been won and lost by only a few votes.
We have the power to shape Queensland's future.
Enrol today. It only takes a few minutes.
Good evening everyone, welcome to Queensland Votes. This is the Griffith University State Election Analysis and I'm joined tonight by Professor Juliette Peach and Professor Anne Tien, and we're going to talk about the first week of their campaign. Now those great ads you saw at the beginning was a research project between the Electoral Commission of Queensland and Griffith University to encourage young people to get out and vote, and we're pretty proud, I must say, of the product. So thank you to all our Griffith students that were involved. First up are our seats to watch. Welcome to Queensland Votes Seats to Watch. I'm Professor Sue Harris-Rimmer. We have assembled Australia's best political scientists and policy researchers to identify the electorates we believe will impact on the outcome of the 2020 Queensland election. Let's start in the north of Queensland, where we've identified 4 seats. Barron River is held by Labor on a 1.9% margin. Barron River covers the northern parts of Cairns and takes in Kuranda and the coastal corridor of Yorkeys Knob and Trinity Beach up to Palm Cove. Former Cairns Regional Councillor Linda Cooper is the LNP candidate, with Jenny Brown for the UAP. Single issue party The Informed Medical Options, Adam Muir is contesting along with Aaron McDonald for the Greens. Barron River is a classic bellwether seat. The outcome of this seat may indicate a change of government, so it's one to watch on election night. Mundingburra, held by Labor on a 1.1% margin. We're already seeing a strong law and order focus in Townsville-based seats, and Mundingburra is no exception. Mundingburra covers southern parts of Townsville along both banks of the Ross River. Sitting member Coralie O'Rourke is not running in 2020 due to ill health and has been replaced as ALP candidate by Les Walker, a former Townsville City Councillor. Former police officer Glenn Doyle has been endorsed by the LNP. Both major parties are vulnerable to swings against them, and how preferences flow from minor parties will be crucial to the outcome. A potential loss here for Labor. A third seat in play in northern Queensland is THURINGOWA, currently held by ALP on a 4.1% margin. THURINGOWA is one of a trio of difficult seats for Labor in Townsville. Voters swung against both Labor and the LNP in 2017, with One Nation and Katter's Australia Party gaining 14.3% and a 15.6% swing respectively. The sitting member Aaron Harper will have his work cut out for him against LNP candidate and former Townsville City Councillor Natalie Marr. With no Pauline Hanson's One Nation candidate running at this election, Katter party preferences will be vital, but it is unlikely to change hands. The final electorate to watch in northern Queensland is Townsville, currently held by Queensland's Deputy Speaker, Labor's Scott Stewart, by a margin of 0.4%. Though the seat has been held by Labor for all but 6 of the last 26 terms, it is now the party's most marginal seat after a 5.3% swing to the LNP in the 2017 election. The LNP candidate John Hathaway previously served as MP in 2012. 8 candidates have been nominated, including former Australian Rugby League player Greg Dowling for Clive Palmer's United Australia Party and former public servant Joshua Schwartz for the Katter Australia Party. With law and order as the main election issue and the likely preference flows, it is difficult to see a pathway for Labor to hold this seat. Now let's head south to central Queensland, to the seat of KEPPEL, currently held by Labor's Brittany Lauger by 3.1%. KEPPEL was created in 1992 and incorporates the Yeppoon, Emu Park and Byfield and surrounding coastal resorts and agricultural areas. In 2017, both ALP and LNP received swings against them, but we saw a massive swing, 25.5%, to Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. In 2020, former Brisbane Bronco and One Nation candidate Wade Rothery is incumbent Brittany Lauger's biggest opponent. Next up, the seat of PUMICESTONE. PUMICESTONE was established in 2001 and includes the retirement haven of Bribie Island and mainland parts of Caboolture, Sandstone Point, Donnybrook and Beachmere. Incumbent MP Simone Wilson is retiring, putting the LNP's 0.8% hold in a precarious position, particularly given the ALP-dominated history of the seat. Former Balonne Shire Deputy Mayor Fiona Gaskey is running for the LNP against Labor's Ali King and the Greens' Richard Ogden. For an electorate largely satisfied with the current government's COVID-19 response and with constituents voting in their fourth new MP in as many terms, this seat is definitely one to watch as the LNP is hanging on by a thread. Heading further south to the swinging North Brisbane seat of Aspley, Labor's Bart Mellish holds it on a 1.2% margin. The electorate of Aspley covers outer northern parts of Brisbane and includes the suburbs of Brisbane Downs, Castledean, Aspley, and parts of Bald Hills, McDowell, Zilmere and Geebung. It includes some strong Liberal voting areas and has been won by the Liberal National Party in 6 out of 10 elections since 1992. Mellish is again recontesting, along with Amanda Cooper for the LNP, a former Brisbane City Councillor. Though marginal, a must-hold for Labor to return to the government benches. To the seat of Clayfield now, held by Tim Nichols, LNP since 2006. Clayfield runs along the northern bank of the Brisbane River and Enoggera Creek and has been a majority LNP seat for most of its history. Nichols, who was opposition leader at the time, is definitely under challenge from the ALP's Philip Anthony for a second time. Clayfield will be a test of whether Premier Palaszczuk's handling of the coronavirus will translate to votes. Former Greens Senator for Queensland Andrew Bartlett is running in the seat and I'm sure is hoping to see another substantial swing to the Greens as in 2017. Now we're moving to Everton, held by the LNP on a 4.9% margin. Straddling the border between Brisbane City Council and Moreton Bay Regional Council, the seat of Everton was established in 1972 and was initially an ALP seat. Former rugby league referee Tim Mander has held the seat since 2012. While it has a 4.9% margin, the electorate is likely to respond positively to the Premier's handling of coronavirus. Mander is challenged in Everton by the ALP's Danielle Shanky. Moving on to the electorate of Mansfield, currently held by the ALP by a 1.6% margin. The electorate of Mansfield covers the string of outer southeast Brisbane suburbs of Wishart and Mansfield. It has been variously held between the Liberal Party, National Party and the ALP. Like other electorates experiencing a swing against Labor and the LNP in the 2017 election in favour of the Greens and One Nation. Former principal of Cavendish Road State High School, Corrine McMillan, ALP, is up against Janet Wishart, LNP, Rob Walter from the Greens and Brendan Taylor from the Legalised Cannabis Queensland Party. No surprise here, South Brisbane is in play, currently held by Labor by 3.6%. South Brisbane covers the inner southern suburbs of Brisbane directly opposite the Brisbane CBD. It has been considered a Labor safe seat for an incredible 105 years, only lost by the party on 3 occasions. It was former Premier's Anna Bligh's seat and has been held by Jackie Trad since the 2012 by-election. The inner city seat is also likely to vote against the coal policies of the Labor government. The main opposition to Labor will be the Greens candidate Amy McMahon, who contested in 2017 and got an 11.7 swing to her. With the Greens already holding this seat in the Brisbane City Council, the Greens are confident of finally winning this Labor prize. The seat of Maywar, held by the Greens' Michael Berkman by a margin of just 1.6%. Maywar was first contested in 2017, having been formed from the parts of the abolished seats of Mount Cootha and Indooroopilly during electoral boundary redistributions. Present MP Michael Berkman won the seat after a close 3-way contest in 2017 and is challenged by Labor candidate Palani Thavar and LNP candidate Lauren Day this time around. Berkman was the first Greens MP in Queensland history in 2017. His narrow victory makes Maywar a marginal seat for the 2020 election. We've chosen Maywar as one of our wildcard seats. Our second wildcard seat is the inner city electorate of MCCONNEL, held by Labor's Grace by a margin of 7.9%. Formerly known as Brisbane Central, MCCONNEL is a wildcard for this election. It has traditionally been a Labor-dominated seat until the Campbell-Newman landslide of 2012, but returned to Labor at the 2015 election. The ALP now holds it with a 7.9% margin. However, like many central Brisbane areas, the Greens have been polling strongly and in the 2017 election recorded a positive 7.8% swing. ALP's incumbent Grace is up against the LNP's Pinky Singh, the Greens' Kirsten Lovejoy and UAP's Malcolm Wood. Gentrification and a strong and growing Greens presence places this seat on a must-watch list for election night. Moving to the Gold Coast seat of Burlleigh, held by the LNP on a 4.9% margin. Burlleigh is a southern Gold Coast electorate carved from the South Coast seat in electoral boundary redraws in 1992. While it has been held by the LNP candidate Michael Hart for the past 3 terms, it is now contested by a large lineup of candidates and a particularly famous local and ALP candidate, 3-time world surfing champion Wayne Rabbit Bartholomew. The combination of rising environmentalism, concerns over Labor's handling of the border closures, and also the introduction of a strong ALP candidate in the form of a popular surfing legend will make this seat the subject of a hotly contested race. Finally, we have the relatively new northern Gold Coast electorate of GAVEN. Incumbent is Labor's Megan Scanlon, who holds the seat by 0.9%. GAVEN was Labor's only Gold Coast victory at the 2017 election, and it remains Labor's second most marginal seat. Megan Scanlon is the Assistant Minister for Tourism, Industry and Development and is challenged by LNP candidate Kirsten Jackson. She is joined by candidates from the Queensland Greens, Pauline Hanson's One Nation, Legalise Cannabis, Queensland and the United Australia Party. This field of candidates indicates there will be a difficult hold for Labor, maybe a near impossible one. And now we cross to our Griffith University Professor of Politics, Peter Van Onselen, who is joining us from Parliament House in Canberra.
A whole bunch of interesting phenomena at play here. We've got the polls that suggest that the Labor Party's in front on the two-party vote, around 52 to 48, but that's close enough for the LNP to well and truly be within striking distance. The constituencies that matter the most in this election are clearly regional Queensland. The reason for that is very simple. Unlike a lot of other states, in Queensland there is a much larger population base outside the capital city of Brisbane, and particularly in those northern regions as well. Very different voter sentiments there as a consequence, and both major parties are going to have to play to that. Interestingly, both sides of politics are saying in the major party divide, in terms of their standoff, that they won't do deals with minor parties in the event of the hung parliament. It'll be interesting to see if they stick to that, if a hung parliament becomes the reality on the other side of the election. A lot of money going into infrastructure, as you would expect in these COVID times, and some of the debates around where that spend is allocated will be very interesting to watch. What federal implications are there for the state election? Well, certainly when it comes to borders, them being closed under Premier Palaszczuk has been a popular decision, and it's something that's been challenged by the federal Liberals, but the state LNP have stayed largely quiet on the issue because of the state popularity. But here's an interesting quirk. I don't see Anthony Albanese doing any campaigning up in Queensland. Premier Palaszczuk wouldn't be very keen on that, given how badly federal Labor has done in the state of Queensland. But when it comes to the coalition side of things, the LNP up there, they're likely to want Scott Morrison to come on board because he's a popular figure in Queensland, having done as well as he did at the last election. And he's had the last 2 weeks in Canberra, which means he's able, under the rules, without exemptions, to be able to visit Queensland and campaign for his Conservative colleagues. That, as a possibility, is one to watch in the second week of the campaign. I'll be back to discuss all of that very soon.
Thanks very much, Peter. Looking good down there in Canberra at Parliament House. And now it's time for Politics on the Couch. I'm joined by Juliet and Anne, and we're going to be talking through the week that started off the campaign. We're going to start thinking about what Peter Van Onselen had to say about Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, coming to Queensland potentially to campaign, and whether that would be a good move on behalf of the LNP.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a bit of an unknown factor there because on the one hand he's fairly popular federally, we know that, but whether that will translate into the Queensland electorate is fairly unclear at this stage. He's quite popular in northern Queensland, or at least that's what they anticipate will be the effect of Scott Morrison coming here. But things have changed quite a lot since the last election, since the last federal election. We have the locals who are not so happy with the outcomes of the Adani mine. There's a lot of people who are unemployed, and of course we've had a pandemic, so the effects now are quite different to what they were during the period of the federal election. So I think we've just got to think about the different context that we're now in, and whether you'll have that same positive effect that they're anticipating.
Yeah, I think that's right. Scott Morrison was probably less popular last May than Bill Shorten was unpopular. So I think it's difficult to translate that effect. I think coming into a natural disaster season that we know is going to be quite serious and severe, the question of Morrison's absence and performance during the bushfire hasn't entirely gone away. So I think, I think Labor will play that really hard. Yes. And you could hear that in Anthony Albanese's budget reply speech last night about, all announcements and no delivery. So I think, it'll be really interesting to see the role that those leaders play. Will we see Albo come up? I don't know that he's necessarily a net positive for the Palaszczuk government. And how will Morrison's kind of, attacks on Anastasia play? I think, I think that could be really risky because he can be quite condescending and hostile. And how that will play in the context of a two women leader campaign, I think will be really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, Queenslanders do not like being told what to do. That's the one thing we can take to the bank.
We don't.
And there is that sense that we have two women leaders, for the first time, and here we have this sense of 3 or 4 males speaking from Canberra telling a female leader what to do, or presumably coming in to kind of help her out. I'm not sure if that's playing well with the...
Well, you see it even in some of the LNP posters. They have ScoMo with a sort of a halo effect and Deb Frecklington behind. I was like, I don't know about that.
Well, I mean, I think in the context of some of the criticism around the budget and how it's being received, and the obvious, how frustrated the government was by the hashtag credible women campaign. I think it could be really interesting, right? He could really get drawn out on that, and needling, Morrison is not that hard actually, as people have found. Of course, needling Anastasia is not that hard either, as we've kind of seen once or twice. So if everybody starts piling on to her, as Brad Hazzard, the New South Wales Health Minister, has done this morning, it'll be interesting to see what people's reaction to that is really. But I don't think there's any great love for either federal leader, and I actually think the senators will play a much more significant role, and we've already seen them do that. We've seen Matt Canavan, we haven't seen, and I think that's interesting, James McGrath, the master campaigner and architect of a lot of the success of the federal campaign last year here in Queensland. So I think those senators are actually potentially more interesting and powerful players, and of course leveraging the marvellous public resources that are available to them to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I assume Labor will be drawing heavily on Jim Chalmers and Murray Watt and Jennifer McAllister and people like that, rather than
whereas
the
last
Albanese.
time, in the last Queensland campaign, the Labor opposition front bench were everywhere. Penny Wong was everywhere. Tanya Plibersek. We just haven't. Well, I mean, for obvious reasons, we haven't seen that this time. The border's shut. But I just don't know that it would be a net benefit.
Well, actually, it might coincide with people pouring over the border, won't it? When the border restrictions are lifting soon, Canberrans can come. It'll be interesting. Or we lose this full.
It's interesting that whether that delaying the borders opening is going to have an effect as well. We don't know yet. I think we're still in that stage of deciding whether there is community transmission still in New South Wales. I think we're still, how many hours have we got to go now before the final decision? How much patience does the Queensland electorate have? We've got many people here who want to see family for Christmas, and it's another unknown. We haven't been through this before, and how are the Queensland electorate going to respond to this, to these continual delays? On the other hand, we know that the Premier is very popular on the closure of borders. So
and another 8 cases in Western Sydney,
You know,
may be sufficient, but is that the case in rural and regional Queensland, where they haven't had any cases? We might see the sort of bit of a, the parallel that you've had in Victoria, where regional Victoria is going, what the hell, you're killing our economy. So, I think it's really hard to
if we're going to go for
know.
another year or so, should we have this whole one Queensland approach? Or should we start being a bit more different?
And of course, if the Premier were here, she'd be saying, why isn't, hang on a minute, I'm doing exactly the same as what Mark McGowan's doing in Western Australia. You're all just piling on to me because it's an election. So, all of that we can expect to see in the next 4 weeks, I guess.
Yes. I guess the other thing is people will be realising that the second wave is alive and well in the UK and Ireland and of course in America there's still cases are climbing. So I assume we will. People will be nervous about the potential for that second wave.
Yeah, and particularly in the wake of the size of the federal budget deficit announced this week.
Oh wow! Yes.
All predicated on the assumption of a vaccine and a number of assumptions about what might happen next year.
Yes, in fact, CSIRO has come out this morning saying that the vaccine hasn't mutated so much that the current vaccines won't work. But of course, none of us were thinking about that, were we? None of us were like, oh, I hope the virus doesn't mutate so much that the current vaccines won't work. And now I'm even more freaked out. So, but anyway, let's get back to Deb and Anastasia and where they started the campaign, because they came out swinging, I think, and they made some unusual choices. So let's think about where the Premier started her campaign. She went straight to Mount Isa, the safest seat in Queensland. What's the thinking behind that? Why did she do that?
Well, Juliet, I think, as a very long-term observer of Queensland politics, a too long observer of Queensland politics, I think she did that because they need to win the north. And, those seats in Townsville are absolutely marginal. I think that the Premier is really concerned about their capacity to hold those. The Northwest Minerals Province and some of the economic opportunities in that part of Northern Australia are something that I think she's quite keen to prosecute. So I think it makes sense for her to go there. Quite interesting to go into the safest seat of Traeger, Bobby Katter's seat, and to make a direct appeal. But I think, again, as we know, the many Queenslands that we talk about and we'll talk about through this coverage, I think she made that choice very strategically. There are 3, 4, 5 seats up there that are really, really close. So she's getting up there and trying to, demonstrate that she's listening. And one-on-one, Anastasia Palaszczuk, I think, is a bit underrated as a campaigner. Not the big public set-piece events, but the face-to-face, she's very, very good at. And she's done that over a long period of time. So we'll see. But the tourism industry is pretty
caused a big
cross.
stir in Mount Isa. That's where my family are. They were not expecting that. But I thought it was really interesting because they both came out very hard. We're not going to do deals. There's no going to be a hung parliament. We're going to govern in our own right. Hi, Robbie Katter. I thought that was a sort of a strange double.
Well, she's got a poor relationship with Katter too,
who
they governed within minority between 2015 and 17 very successfully, and then she made that decision to take resources off the Katter's Australia Party after a Fraser Anning speech. So there was a lot of weird things going on there, and I think the personal's political, as we know, right? So very interesting to see where he stands in that come a hung parliament on 31st of October.
Yeah, and I think the opposition leader obviously has very strong links with the mining industry, so she's kind of moving in on LNP territory there. And I think there's this sense that she wants to be out there listening to the community, to be seen to be listening to the community, to be responding to this big problem that we have with jobs. And I think what's interesting is that you often talk with families and relatives of those who work in the mining industry and have had health impacts from working in the mining industry. They just want a job, but they don't necessarily want it for their children. And I think so she's really got to play that very carefully, that yes, I'm here to help you now, but I've also got a plan for the future for your children, where there are, where they'll have a safer job in the future. We will have jobs in sustainable energy, and I think it's about getting that balance right, responding to the needs as they are now. They need to feed their families. That's really important, and I think that's what she might be strategically trying to do in a very difficult time for
Indeed, because
everyone.
that transition, that
Yeah.
pathway wasn't clear to those communities in the 2019 federal campaign, and hence why Labor got such a reaction in the caravan of anti-Adani protesters that came up. People found that kind of quite offensive. So it's interesting to see now, as the economy has shifted so profoundly and the disadvantage in those communities is so great, and Scott has alluded to some of that, how that dynamic changes. I mean, Deb Frecklington's decision to start on the Gold Coast is interesting for a couple of reasons, right?
Very much so.
They hold 9 out of the 10 seats there. GAVEN, a quite marginal seat that, likely will go back to the coalition. I think she was trying to leverage the border discontent. So I think, I think that's relevant as well, and maybe trying to hold on to the seats like Currumbin and Burlleigh, where, as you know, Sue, Wayne Rabbit Bartholomew, is the captain's pick candidate for that seat. So there's kind of multiple things going on. The LNP have got an excellent ground game, and they've left a lot of their infrastructure in place from the federal election. So I think people like us are going, I wonder what they're up to, but it's actually quite hard.
But it was interesting. It was like the election will be won and lost in North Queensland, so I'm going to start on the Gold Coast. And I thought, that's an interesting decision. Both of them said jobs and plans roughly 1 million times each. So I thought that's clearly jobs, plans. That's what we've got. There wasn't actually a lot of differentiation around.
Those talking points can be a bit constraining, can't they?
A little bit, yes.
Yeah. And of course, again, the LNP has to win seats in the southeast. They have to. They hold 4 seats in Brisbane at the moment.
Yeah, if they're going to get the 9, they have to pick up some more.
And we've got several of them changing hands, haven't we, on our seats to watch?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, they're definitely with a chance. The other thing that's happened is, this is a very historic election. There are 2 female candidates battling it out for the first time in Australian history. So welcome to 2020, everyone. It's excellent. What I thought was, oh gosh, this cue thousands of Courier Mail articles about what they're wearing, but they've both gone the high vis. So I think there's going to be like 1,000 shades of fluoro in this campaign, both of them. All their pictures are them in high vis vests. Now, wouldn't you think they'd get into scrubs every now and then, or a lab coat in the pandemic? Why is there this obsession with the high vis? I just don't know if it's appealing to the people. And
construction has not lost that many jobs actually overall.
They kept going. The fly-in, fly-out stuff all kept going. So it's like, I'm not sure it's going to appeal to young voters in the way that they need to. So we'll have quite a lot of material around the younger generation, how they're going to vote, because they're going to be a very deciding factor in this election.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had very little focus on how young voters will, we're not sure how they will vote in terms of, are they supportive of the borders closing or not? I mean, they want to get moving. They want to, this is the generation that travel around the world.
Yeah.
They're stuck living with their parents, many of them. They've had to return home because they can't afford to live in inner city apartments anymore. They've really been quite impacted by what's happening, but we don't really hear their experiences of what's happening during the pandemic, other than perhaps mental health impacts. We are hearing there is that side.
And those budget announcements from the federal government around the doubling of mental health visits, I think will be extremely well received, and particularly in regional areas. I mean, in some of our regional areas, youth unemployment is 30+%. So I think you're spot on, Juliet, with that. I mean, the proxy we've got for young people turning out is the same-sex marriage plebiscite, isn't it? That's kind of, and then the local government elections where they actually turned out much less. So the concerted campaign that we've seen the Electoral Commission running about trying to get young people to turn out. But yeah, I mean, it's a pretty invidious choice for you if you're just turned 18 and thinking about the university, the job-ready graduates package that passed yesterday.
Yes.
The likelihood that the Prime Minister and David Littleproud would like you to go and pick fruit in the regions. And there is a lot of pressure from regional local governments about the fact that they can't fill skill shortages, and that's a legitimate issue for them. So kind of quite interesting about how that plays for the younger cohort in Queensland this time.
Yeah, and I think for older Queenslanders, the aged care commission is still coming along, and I think there's a lot for older Queenslanders to think about too, about where they place their vote. So a lot of our coverage at Griffith is going to be around the kind of inequalities revealed by COVID and how the politicians are going to be responding to them. So we're really interested in this idea of, people, their vote matters in a way in this election that might not have ever mattered before. It's sort of like a post-war budget, really, isn't it? A post-war election. It's really about who's going to look after you, who do you trust to look after you in really dark times. So that's what we'll be focused on.
For
Definitely,
those place-based spatial differentiators in were really clear themes of both the 2015, the 2017 and the 2019 elections. So you always see those differentials so much more starkly in Queensland, don't you? Because of the diversity across the state.
That's right.
Really, really interesting.
So now we want to talk about a few really historic elements of this election. Again, first, this is the first Queensland fixed term election, so we've got 4 years up for grabs and the dates are set. So how does that affect campaigning? In a normal year, that would be a big advantage to the incumbent, but of course, 2020 is not a normal year. But the other aspect to this election, of course, is pandemic voting. So no door knocking, how to vote cards could be transmitting viruses. It's all a different idea. You have to campaign differently, and there's a lot of incentives for people to postal vote or pre-poll vote. So that might delay our results for the election. So we've heard from the Electoral Commission of Queensland already that there have been 555,000 odd postal vote applications, and Anthony Green's predicting it'll be around the 60 to 70%. So that means surely the party should get their messages out a little earlier than normal. Hey, no more electoral, here's our policies the night before stuff, which we've been seeing in modern times. So have you got some reflections, experts Juliet and Anne, on how this whole fixed term voting in a pandemic show is going to unfold?
Yeah, I mean, in the Queensland local elections, we certainly had a big postal vote component. Whether that will continue for this election now that there's less community transmission now, we can see people are out in the community and less fearful. However, the pandemic is likely to have this big kind of cultural shift. I think overall we're seeing young people I can do a lot from home, I can just get on my laptop, I can send things. And it's just we're seeing a transformation in the whole economy. So that could play out in this election that, that's how elections are done now. So young people are going to see that we can just, this is how we vote. We don't necessarily have to go down to the local school and vote. And there will be a significant loss there, of course, in terms of handing out how to vote cards and that whole community. And we're seeing that loss in a range of different sectors, that whole pandemic effect. And
I actually think it's kind of tragic at one level because, having been through so many Queensland elections, you can just feel the baseball bat. So there's nothing like going to a polling station and absolutely viscerally being able to feel the outcome. So I think this makes it quite difficult. I mean, I don't hear the baseball bats this time, but the regions could be wielding them and having them up on their veranda, as Wayne Goss, kind of famously said. I think the other thing, of course, is
how do you read the mood?
How do you read the mood? And the mood's so disparate, and if you can't be out, on the ground, kind of picking that stuff up, it's quite hard. But I think the other thing that's kind of surprising about the 4-year term is kind of how ill-prepared they seemed. Like they've known for the last 2 years and 9 months that this was going to be the fixed term parliament. But I guess the pandemic has just put so much, up into the air. We know the LNP is much better resourced than Labor is in terms of financial donations, because we've got our real-time donations reporting here in Queensland now. So how are they going to use that to mobilise in and around the pre-poll voting, I think is very interesting. But of course we know too that those votes, you have to apply for them, I think, by the 16th. So you've got to be organised, otherwise you are going to have to turn out in your local polling station. Maybe people will be glad. But yeah, really it changes a lot, doesn't it, in terms of the dynamic on the day. And how much we all look forward to it. I know everyone looks forward to it. Surely.
Much easier to avoid how to vote cards too, right? You just have to not open the mail.
and they can get a bit unpleasant too, and particularly in the 2015 campaign it was pretty unpleasant. So I think a lot of people want to just do it in their privacy. But will they remember to BYO pencil?
Got to BYO pencil, people. That's a big message. And I also think, how are you going to... This is a policy-driven, should be a policy-driven election. People should be voting knowing this is the economic recovery plan of one and the economic recovery plan of the other, and this is how it's going to affect me. It's absolutely crucial, more than it's ever been. So if they don't release that until very, very late and everyone's already voted, it's not good. The other thing I was thinking is I don't think the electorate would be interested in stunts. You know, there's a more sort of serious tone in a pandemic. We're in the middle of a national emergency. You're not going to go for the stunts, I would have thought.
No,
but I might be wrong.
You know, to go back to sort of our earlier conversation about the grip on the border,
Yes.
the terror of an outbreak for the government that's handled it pretty well in terms of the public health outcome. Their terror of that, will that relax in the last 2 weeks? I'm not sure, because it would only take a cluster, an outbreak,
That's right.
to just throw the entire thing into pandemonium, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's very easy to make a mistake, as we know, on the campaign trail. And, you know, the LNP front bench are not that experienced as shadow ministers and actually haven't had a lot of scrutiny on them since 2017. So it'd be very interesting to see how dirty some of the campaigning gets and how much pressure is sought to be brought to bear.
And do you think they'll go presidential? Do you think it'll be all Deb Frecklington right out front?
I don't think it can be. I don't know about you, Julia, but her, you know, I mean, she was nearly replaced as leader by her own party, whose president was working for Clive Palmer in an only in Queensland kind of scenario. So she, you know, her numbers are not good. So I don't know. I think they'll be looking to the team. You know, I mean, I'm no campaign genius, but I would think it's a bit hard. They've been very much trying to position her as the common sense. You know, she's driving the big truck. Does that work in the southeast where they need to win seats? And we haven't even talked about the Greens yet, in terms of where the Greens fit in that, in some of the inner city.
Yeah, well, the Greens came out swinging yesterday, I saw, all this Minerals Council business, mineral lobby. But, you know, they could definitely take some of the inner city seats if the Liberals do, if the LNP say we're going to put Labor last, even in those two strategic seats in inner city Brisbane. Interesting choice, I would have thought, that they're just going to go blanket, we're putting the ALP last, all over the state, regardless of the consequences. Interesting.
Well, of course, we're back to compulsory preferential voting this term as well, whereas we had optional preferential voting at the last election. It's just, no wonder no one can predict the result.
So many unknowns. And we've got all these minor parties jostling for influence up in, where is it, THURINGOWA, MUNDINGBURRA. So in Townsville, of course, Morani. So, and without those how to vote cards for the postal vote, we just, who knows? It's going to be quite interesting to see what happens with that minor party influence and of course with the Greens.
With the entire Palmer family running in, in seats across the state,
and their
what
friends.
will be the impact?
Yeah. I mean, you've got that whole anti-Labor sentiment with those big billboard signs all the way up the Bruce Highway. They're enormous, and they sort of come out from the sugarcane fields, and they're quite dramatic. I mean, I haven't seen, and of course we've got the One Nation billboards up there as well. And it has quite an interesting effect because you're driving on the Bruce Highway, and there's potholes everywhere, it's slippery. You know, you get that sense that what's happened to northern Queensland as you're moving past Rockhampton, you know, there's this sense that there is a bit of neglect there, and then you get these big billboards that here we are.
And we have anticipated in previous elections a bit of blowback to the federal government from around natural disaster funding. And the funding, I think it was $1 billion that Labor claimed the government hadn't provided after the last time the Bruce Highway washed away in those natural disasters. So it's about who people think is responsible for that stuff, and is that what's on their minds, as some of those more nuanced issues would be, or are they so existentially concerned about the economy, their kids' prospects, unemployment? As you say, Sue, this is a post-war. That's the only equivalent we've kind of got. Is the economy going to be just the only thing that people are thinking about?
If you think about the One Nation billboards, they're very confusing to me, as usual. But, to go for the Bradfield scheme and the South East Queensland Olympics as your big... Really?
And opposing the South East Queensland Olympics.
Opposing the South East Queensland Olympic bid and the Bradfield scheme. Really?
Well, and of course, the government, kind of tried to negate the Bradfield scheme, idea, long discredited scientifically idea, by appointing a specialist commission to look into it that's being chaired by Ross Garnaut, currently living in Barcaldine, to have some Queensland credentials and credibility. So, you can see that actually Labor must have thought that was something, that they've put some energy and attention into that. But
water security is a real issue, of course.
Indeed. But, of course, now the debt and deficit disaster history wars are over, we're told. So what does that mean for the LNP that might have wanted to run on, Labor's debt, or Queensland Labor's debt, which actually is very high and, among the highest in the nation?
I was looking at my back in black mug. I'm going to keep that. It's going to be worth something.
You might need to raise money for that, using that for something.
Yeah, auction it off. All right, let's talk about the deputies. Let's see if they're going to be out and about in the campaign. Stephen Miles for Labor and Tim Mander for the LNP. Your thoughts, electoral assets?
Yeah, I think it's interesting their responses to the pandemic as well. And Stephen Miles has been out there every day informing the public about, how many cases we have. And I think that's been a great electoral opportunity for the Labor Party in particular. They've had that coverage every single day. So we've all got to know them quite personally in a way, because it impacts our lives. So we're kind of looking to them for advice each day. Well, that was certainly, when the pandemic was at its peak. So he's coming across as a trusted source of authority in that respect, and he does have respect for, Dr. Young. He's very respectful of health advice. So in that regard, and of course, Stephen Miles was there to support Palaszczuk when there were all of those attacks coming from the south about her not opening the borders. They were quite personal, and I think he really put an end to that on the day after when the Premier had had enough of all they were quite mean and quite targeted. And I think that's where he really shone in a way, where we got to know him as a Deputy Premier.
Of course, he stepped into that role after Jackie Trad moved out of the Deputy Premiership in controversial circumstances. And I think in lots of ways the divisions within the Labor Cabinet have been very clear forever between the dominant left faction, and Anastasia, of course, has never had the numbers in the Cabinet since she's been the Premier and since she's been the leader now for a very long time. I think it's really interesting that, of course, Labor will want everybody to focus on Stephen Miles as the kind of a revelation almost, a pretty unrecognised character, because it is quite leader focused, back to your earlier point, but he has stepped into that deputy role and given the Premier some support, even though he's himself from the left faction. So I think that presence has kind of been claimed. On the other, he's a bit pugnacious, and some of that pugnacity has kind of meant he's had to walk back a few times. That's not where the LNP campaign's focused. Jackie Trad's face is on all side by side with Anastasia in all of the ads that I've seen so far, and all the posters that I've seen so far. And actually there aren't that many. There's many more Clive Palmer posters than there are sort of major party ones. Tim Mander, that we've talked about him so little, is indicative, I think, of how difficult it is for an opposition deputy to get much attention. He's, of course, in the seat of Everton, quite marginal.
Yeah, he's got his own race to run, right?
He has got his own race to run, but of course in the strange dynamic that is the LNP that was born here in Queensland, as where the National Party have traditionally been dominant, he's really supposed to be the appeal to the southeast and to the inner city voters, and I'm just not sure how well he's able to execute that. He's a very important social conservative around the strong religious community following that he has in his seat and in some of those northern and peri-urban seats. So it'll be interesting to see, but head to head you'd have to say that, and it's a benefit of incumbency, as you've pointed out, Juliet, but to what extent is that playing out in the shadow cabinet dynamics, that they're a strong team. He mobilised the support for Deb Frecklington when people were trying to roll her. So quite interesting how the parliamentary wing hung together during that extraordinary fiasco in the lead up.
Talk about timing.
Well, it's the indiscipline, isn't it? Like, it's the indiscipline of 26 years in opposition of the last 31. Like, seriously, you need to get your act together if you want to win.
But it's all the more important because they're the shadow cabinet in caretaker government now in a pandemic, so they will be being briefed in a different way now that we've entered caretaker. They are, treated as a government in waiting, and they have to assume some of that responsibility right now.
They do. And of course, there's such bitterness from the, post-Bligh period to now in the opposition being forced out of the parliamentary annex. They don't have spaces there. They're in a ghastly building in, outside the parliament. So there's lots of, nastiness there to play out yet, I think. But they'll be pretty busy in these 93 different and quite idiosyncratic campaigns going on across the state.
Imagine if we still had an upper house. This would be impossible to figure out, wouldn't it?
That's another story.
That's another story. That's another episode. Thanks for joining us for the very first episode of Queensland Votes. We'll see you next week.